Okay, so we're going to get started. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Al Huang. I'm the Environmental Justice Director at the Institute for Policy Integrity, and this is the WEAC Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center, TCTAC EPA Region 2 for New York, New Jersey training. And the training today is on federal rulemaking process and environmental justice. Thank you for joining us. As we get started, there's just some housekeeping to get started with, some logistics. First, I just want to let everyone know this meeting is being recorded. The recording and slides will be shared on our TCTAC website in the future. Please keep yourself muted while the presenter is speaking. The presenter is me, obviously. If you have any questions prior to the Q&A portion of the session, please drop it in the chat, and we'll get to those later. And during the Q&A section, we will answer questions from the chat, and you can use the raised hand reaction in Zoom. So a little bit of information about the TCTAC program. There are 18 TCTACs in the country. There's 3 national TCTACs, and there's 15 regional TCTACs. Our Region 2 TCTAC is New Jersey, New York, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and 8 federally recognized Indian nations. In this particular TCTAC, we look at New York, New Jersey, and 8 federally recognized Indian nations. U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico have their own TCTAC. A little more information about our TCTAC. It was launched by EPA in conjunction with the Department of Energy to ensure that EJ communities receive the support they need to benefit from the funding directed by the Justice 40 Initiative, Inflation Reduction Act, and Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The goals of WEAC's TCTAC, this TCTAC, are to, 1, build power and knowledge in EJ communities, 2, to create strength in EJ networks within our region, to help groups gain access to grant and funding opportunities, and to help groups advance and address environmental and energy justice issues. Our grant period is 5 years, ends in 2028. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is Region 2, New York, New Jersey, and 8 Indian nations of New York. So welcome. Today's training is going to focus on federal rulemaking process and environmental justice. We've done some other trainings that you may or may not have attended. We did one on Justice 40 and the Suggest tool. We did another one on federal and state environmental justice law and policy. And we're building on that with today's federal rulemaking and environmental justice. So today we're going to focus on federal rules. We have our next training coming up in December, which will be on state rulemaking. But today we're going to focus on federal rulemaking and environmental justice. Here's the outline for today's training. We're going to answer the following questions. 1, what are federal rules related to environmental protection, and how do they impact an environmental justice community? What are the steps federal agencies take to make rules? How is EJ considered in rulemaking? And what opportunities are there for communities to influence the rulemaking process? After I kind of do the general outline about federal rulemaking, then we're going to discuss a case study. I'm going to show you a video, which should be fun, about EPA's risk management plan rule under the Clean Air Act and how environmental justice communities engaged and influenced federal rulemaking. So I thought we'd start with this graphic here that we created, just to kind of situate you on what we're talking about today. So here we have kind of a generic facility that might be in your community. And you can see here it's got some air emissions coming from the smokestack, some solid waste or hazardous waste of some kind to the left of the facility. You'll see that there's a plume of discharge going into this river, and the river has a wetland, and there's some housing here. And so when you look at a facility like this, there are many layers to how it is often regulated. One layer is at the most local level. Like, these are local municipal regulations. And what these are usually are cities and towns have their own land use and zoning requirements that dictate how and where things are built. So for any facility to be in our community first, it's got to go through that process of regulation. The next layer we have is state regulation. So these are state laws that are passed by the state legislature, and then state agencies issue rules to implement the law. Our next training that I mentioned in December is going to focus on that too. There are other state laws too that regulate a facility. States have what's called their own body of common law, and that regulates issues like nuisance, noise, and odors. And then our last training that we did, the one before this one, 2 months ago, was on federal and state EJ laws and policies. These also apply to these facilities. And then finally, there's federal regulation. That's what we're going to focus on today. These are when the US Congress passes laws, and then federal agencies issue rules to implement that law. So what you might see from a federal level are rules that are passed at a federal level affect every facility, whichever that rule applies to, in the entire country. Whereas state regulation obviously would only apply to facilities that's being regulated in that state. So in some ways, federal regulation really has a big impact because it could potentially impact entire sectors. So in this example here on this image here, you have a power plant. The federal government has rules that regulate power plants. States might have their own too as well that they pass through their own legislature. So what is federal rulemaking? We're going to break it down here for you. Generally, a rules or a regulation is a directive issued by a federal agency that interprets and enforces the law. You'll see rule regulation, those words out there, they're often used interchangeably, and for the purpose of today's training, we're just going to use the word rule. So federal agencies create, amend, and repeal rules, which means like withdraw them, take them away, through a process called rulemaking. And this is what the process we're going to talk about today. The agencies get their authority to issue rules from laws passed by Congress. So when Congress passes a law, it often delegates rulemaking authority to a specific agency to achieve that law's goals. And for environmental laws, rulemaking is often delegated to agencies like EPA, U.S. Forest Service, Department of Interior, Department of Energy. And then those agencies are the ones that are passing or creating the rules and going through this process. And then once a rule is finalized, oftentimes it can be followed by the issuance of more specific guidance. Rules have the force of law, however, and guidance does not. So what is the rulemaking process? There's generally 3 steps, and we're going to unpack each one. There's the pre-rule stage, the proposed rule stage, and then the final rule stage. So before we kind of unpack those, let's just go over some key terms that are going to come up in the rulemaking process. One is the Administrative Procedures Act, the APA. This is a federal law that governs the basic requirements that agencies must follow when creating rules, such as requiring agencies to provide public notice, to seek comment prior to enacting most regulations. And they also provide rules and processes around how courts review rules as well. The Federal Register, we're going to talk about it a bit today. It's kind of commonly known as the newspaper of the federal government, and it's where agencies must publish any major changes in its policies or rules that might affect the public. And all stages of rulemaking are noticed and posted in the Federal Register, and the posting is where you'll often see calls for public comments. The rulemaking docket. So this is a term, and what it means, it's a place that contains all the agency's relevant rulemaking announcements, materials, supporting documents, including economic environmental analysis, studies, other references, all public comments that have been submitted, and all the relevant documents. And you could find the docket for each rule at regulations.gov. There's a hyperlink here if you want to use this in the future. Through regulations.gov, you can access any electronic docket by searching the unique identifier, which is usually listed in the Federal Register notice, or you can do a keyword search using key terms to find the rule that you're looking for. And public comments are formal responses submitted by individuals, organizations, or other stakeholders in response to requests for public comments by federal agencies. So now we've covered kind of these key terms. Let's unpack, excuse me, the pre-rule stage. So the first stage is what we call initiating rulemaking. And generally there's 3 ways that agencies can do this. One is a basic legal mandate. Congress passes a law, and in that law, it specifically says that an agency needs to promulgate a rule, and it might even set a timeline for the initiation of that rulemaking, like within this many days or this many years of this law being passed, X agency must promulgate rulemaking on whatever issue it might be. So that's the first way. The second way is the agency itself identifies a need. So the agency decides to propose a new rule or modify an existing rule. So this oftentimes happens when there's new technology, new science, there's great public interest in the issue, Or, like if you take climate, for example, we have laws, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act that regulate air and water, but we don't have a federal climate law, or we didn't have one at the time that a lot of these laws were passed. So an agency might say, well, we need to address climate and we're going to use our authorities under these existing laws, and they might identify that as a need to do rulemaking. And then finally, the third way is through petitioning. So this is when stakeholders can ask or petition an agency, and they can either ask them to renew a rule, to modify an existing rule, to initiate a new rulemaking, or to withdraw a rule. And when we talk about the case study later on, all these examples come up. So once an agency has decided that it wants to initiate rulemaking, it will publish its plans. And agencies publish their plans to something called the Regulatory Plan or Unified Agenda. And that's posted in reginfo.gov and regulations.gov. These are both government websites on rules. And these are really useful for a lot of reasons. One is that it's a good way for the public to kind of see what an agency has in store for a year. And you can start thinking about like what rules are coming up, what you might want to comment on, and kind of just gives you an idea of what agencies are up to and what they're going to be focusing their energies on next year. And also helps you decide how do you want to spend your time or allocate your resources if there's something you might want to get involved in. So once that happens, typically there's a request for comments. And usually at the pre-rule stage, it comes in two different forms. One is a request for information. This is the most general request that they might make for comments. And usually they're asking questions about like, how should we implement this law? Should we issue a new rule? Or is there a need to change an existing rule? Another more formalized way, which is usually a little more specific, is called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And this will describe the rule the agency is thinking about, explain the issues around it, and it might ask the public specific questions, including whether rulemaking should be initiated. So that's the pre-rule stage. After the pre-rule stage, people have submitted comments now, and the agency will kind of review those comments and will draft the proposed rule. Sometimes this can take a short amount of time. Sometimes this can take a long amount of time. But this is usually where the agency starts writing what the rule is going to be. And we're going to talk more about this later on, but one key part of the rulemaking process is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. They're part of the Office of Management Budget that's in the White House. And what they do is they provide oversight of rulemaking. And they'll get involved in the pre-proposed rule stage and the final rule stage, and they're reviewing to make sure that the rulemaking, and we're going to cover this in more detail a little bit later, has kind of met most regulatory principles that laws, executive orders, and policies say they should have. And also they'll do an interagency review. They'll make sure that a lot of rules that an agency will pass might implicate other agencies. And so they'll talk to the other agencies, bring them in, and make sure that those issues are settled. So if the rule is significant, OIRA will get involved. Like I said, we'll talk more about that later. Next, after that is a notice of proposed rulemaking will be published in the Federal Register. Here's a picture of kind of what it looks like when they make the announcement. And this formally launches now the proposed rule stage phase of rulemaking. And at this point, there'll usually be a public comment period. And we're going to talk more about what that looks like and some tips and tricks around public comments. So let's talk a little more about both of these again. The notice of proposed rulemaking. So like I said before, this is published in the Federal Register. Usually what it has is a summary in there, and it will talk about what the issues and actions are under consideration. There'll usually also be a section of supplementary information that discusses the merits of the rule. It might cite data and information that the agency used to develop the rule. And oftentimes it will detail why it made the choices that the agency did and the reasoning behind it. And also typically, this is where you'll find the full text of the proposed regulation. And it usually appears after the preamble section of the rule itself. And also, this is where you'll first see the regulatory impact analysis and environmental justice analysis. These are kind of the meat of the internal analysis that the agency does to justify a rule, where they're considering environmental justice, social benefits, issues, and we're going to talk about that in more detail later on, because that's probably of most interest to folks on this call. The public comment period. Okay, so typically public comment period for a new rule is 60 days, but depending on the rule, it can also be 30 or 90 days. You want to read the Federal Register. The Federal Register notice will be clear about what the public comment timeline deadline is. And the comments are accepted through regulations.gov. So that site, again, where the docket is also where people will be posting and submitting your comments. So it's all through an online format. Oh, just one point about that. Like, it might vary from agency to agency, especially independent agencies like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They might have their own specific way that they want you to submit comments. But the rule of thumb is to read the Federal Register notice, which will explain exactly how public comments need to be submitted. And after the comment period closes, the agency will review all the comments that it received, and then it will decide whether to make changes in responses to the comments. And also at this point in the stage is where the agency will often hold a public hearing. This is discretionary unless the specific law that they're using to do the rulemaking requires a hearing, or if an agency has a policy around it. So for example, EPA has lots of policies around rules regarding environmental justice and strongly encourage and almost require that they hold a public hearing. So it depends on the agency policy, and also depends on the rule itself. And again, this is something you can always request, especially if there's like high public interest in an issue. You could and they don't have a hearing. That's something you could request through your comments. So what I mentioned before, the regulatory impact analysis. Now we're going to kind of dig into what this is. Like I said before, this is sort of the meat of a proposed rule. And so when considering significant rules, agencies must conduct a regulatory impact analysis. And this is according to executive orders issued by presidents, as well as policies and guidance that agencies use to do rulemaking. And inside the regulatory impact analysis is where there's an evaluation of a variety of economic and environmental impacts. And the regulatory impact analysis is always published along with the proposed rules and part of the rulemaking docket, so the public can see it, comment on it, ask questions, and get the agency to respond to you. Regulatory impact analysis may also consider, when relevant, appropriate values like equity, human dignity, fairness, potential distributional impacts, which we'll talk about in a little bit, privacy and personal freedom. And this is through executive orders and internal guidance as well. So these are the basic steps an agency takes in a regulatory impact analysis. So we'll just walk through them really quickly for you. One is they need to identify need for the action, and they need to identify regulatory options. So typically when a rule is proposed, there are at minimum, usually three regulatory options that are proposed. One is what the agency is actually proposing. And then two is like a more stringent version of what the agency is proposing. And then the third option might be a weaker version of that. And part of this is so they can kind of see the differences between those and then make decisions based on cost and benefits to society. And the second step they take is to define the baseline. So what this means is like, what does the world look like without the rule? And that's the starting point that you do this analysis. So you assume the rule doesn't exist, and you start there, and then you add the rule, and then you analyze what the impacts are of having that rule. And in that analysis, you describe the consequences of each of the options that you've identified in that first step. The next step is then you evaluate the cost of benefits of each option. And we're going to get to that in a second in the next slide. And then finally, you describe the analysis and results through a summary, which is the regulatory impact analysis section of a proposed rule. So what is cost benefit analysis? To many of you, this might sound like a scary thing, but I promise you that almost all of you probably use cost benefit analysis on a daily basis in making simple decisions like what you want to eat for lunch, or what kind of financial decisions you might want to make in your life, but also just in basic kind of decision making. You're always kind of weighing the pluses and minuses. That's essentially what a cost benefit analysis is. And in the rulemaking process, what cost benefit it's an analytical tool to ensure that the benefits of a rule justify the cost to society. And in rulemaking, the benefits and costs should be quantified and monetized to the fullest extent possible and presented both in physical units. An example of that might be like in environmental context, a number of illnesses avoided or the number of work days lost, as well as monetary terms. I mean, you can usually monetize things like number of work days missed. You can monetize that by turning it and looking at wages and lost wages. And same with illnesses. It might be like school days missed, work days missed, visits to the doctor, whatnot. And then when you can't quantify a particular benefit or cost, it should be described qualitatively, like through a narrative. And I think in the environmental justice context, this is often very common. There's a lot of environmental justice lived experience impacts that are difficult to quantify. And in that case, it doesn't mean that they don't have to consider it in cost benefit. They should describe it. If they can't quantify it, they should describe it qualitatively. However, in cost benefit, I think one thing that is revealed is that oftentimes with a rule, the cost of that rule for those who enjoy its benefits and the cost of the regulation itself often are not the same people, right? And I think for most of you here, you probably can understand like what that means. And as part of that, within cost benefit analysis, there is a tool that can be used, that agencies use to kind of figure out what that looks like. And it's called a distributional analysis. And what that does is it provides insight into the cost of how the cost and benefits are distributed across the population economy. And oftentimes you can look at things like income group, gender, sex, race, industrial sector, age, geography. And sometimes many laws require that when an agency is doing rulemaking, they have to consider, for example, distributional effects to children, distributional effects to workers, right? And basically what that means is that they take the cost and benefits and they disaggregate them, and then they try to see how they're distributed based on each of those individual groups, whether it's race, income, age, and you want to see how are the costs and benefits distributed among those populations. Regulatory impact analyses should, but in practice don't always provide a description of these distributional effects. And without that, it's really hard for decision makers to consider properly how the rule might affect the economy and overall social welfare. Especially now with a lot of the equity requirements that this administration has imposed through executive order. The distribution analysis is one of the few tools that the agency can actually use to see what are the equity impacts of the rule that they're promulgating. However, like I was mentioning earlier, agencies don't often do a distributional analysis. And it's something that you could ask for and request and ask questions about in your comments. So what is an EJ analysis, environmental justice analysis? I mentioned this earlier too. This is separate and distinct from the distributional analysis, which is part of cost benefit. And where it comes from is from the wealth of executive orders going back as far as President Clinton on environmental justice. And those executive orders, and including the most recent one from President Biden, 14096, call on federal agencies to, quote, identify, analyze, and address the potential for disproportionate and adverse human health or environmental effects on how they do their federal programs, policies, and activities. And it specifies to look at specific communities, low income, people of color, tribes. The EO also says that agencies need to consider the impacts of climate change, cumulative impacts, as well as historic inequities and systemic barriers to accessing federal policies and programs and their actions. And finally, these EOs also say that agencies should include meaningful, accessible community involvement in their decision-making process. So these requirements are the basis of what you will often see is called an environmental justice analysis in a proposed rule. And usually this EJ analysis focuses on identifying and analyzing specific socio-demographic characteristics like race, ethnicity, income, and how they correlate with higher exposure to pollution, lack of environmental benefits, and increased vulnerability. And they also focus on identifying and analyzing the role of existing historical conditions that might contribute to that vulnerability of already heavily burdened communities and populations. Typically, the EJ analysis will appear in the docket, either in the regulatory impact analysis, in the preamble, or in the preamble to the proposed rule, or oftentimes it's also a separate technical support document. And it's usually pretty lengthy and will describe the different communities that might be affected by this rule, how they might be affected, as well as what is the historic inequity or systemic barriers or cumulative impacts that community has faced over the years. And in theory, what this forces the agency to do is to determine whether the rule will have an environmental justice impact. And yet, remember, they're going to be doing this analysis for each one of those regulatory options, right? So once the proposed rule stage is done, and you should see all those analyses I mentioned earlier, we're now in the final rule stage. So the agency reviews all the comments they got, and they draft that final rule. This could take some time too. The draft final rule is approved within the agency through their own internal processes. And then, if significant, it's reviewed and approved by OIRA. And I mentioned this earlier. We're going to talk about it again later. This, again, is the second time that there's a Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, kind of a White House review of a rule. Then the final rule is published in the Federal Register. And then it's published in the Code for Federal Regulations, which is like the book of laws for our government. And then at that point, once the rule has been published, the rule's in effect. At that point, a rule can be subject to judicial review from a lawsuit. So OIRA, who are they? Why should you engage and how? I mentioned earlier that they're part of the White House, and their main goal is to ensure an agency complies with the regulatory principles in Executive Order 12866, which includes promoting public participation at all stages of rulemaking, incorporating public comment, considering alternatives to rulemaking, and analyzing both costs and benefits. So if a rule comes to OIRA in the proposed rule stage and final rule stage, and it's missing these pieces, those are things that OIRA can go back to the agency and request that they do fulfill, or at least ask the question of why they haven't done it. They also ensure the rules are consistent with the law, they promote the president's priorities, and they benefit the public. As I was mentioning earlier, I mean, presidential executive orders like this particular administration has emphasized and prioritized equity. If a rule comes back to OIRA and they don't see equity analysis in there, that's something that they could ask for and send back to the agency. It's also something that you as citizens can ask for OIRA to do. So you can submit comments or meet with OIRA while a rule's under their review, either at the proposal or final stage. And if you want to request a meeting, you have to use the form available at reginfo.gov. These meetings are kind of unique, and it's pretty effective in these meetings probably to raise comments regarding equity, like as I mentioned before, potential distributive impacts of a rule, because I mentioned before what that is as well. And it's also a good opportunity to reinforce points you previously made to the agency. That being said, though, OIRA meetings are not a substitute for public comments. You should always comment to the agency that do the rulemaking. We're going to talk about that a little bit in the next couple of slides about public comments. But OIRA meetings are on top of, not a substitute for those public comments. Another interesting thing is that on reginfo.gov, there's a log kept of all meetings of who has met with OIRA for each rule, and you can organize by rule, and you could see who met with OIRA, what the agenda of that meeting is. They have to publish that, whether they were presented, OIRA was presented with any materials, and who attended those meetings. Why that's actually useful is that, like, let's say you are involved in a rulemaking and it's facing major industrial kind of opposition. If you go look at that log, you might see like that industry is going and meeting with OIRA. And the case study we're going to talk about later, EJ advocates saw that, and then they would then schedule a meeting and they would see what the agenda is. They would respond to the points to make sure that OIRA was hearing their perspective as well. So now we've talked about OIRA, we're going to move on to public comment generally and kind of why you should do them, some tips about doing them and such. So the first thing is, why do you do public comment? So the first part, obviously, is to convince an agency to change or improve a proposal or to adopt a particular proposal, usually in response to that request for information or that advance notice of proposed rulemaking. The second reason that you would submit public comments is to bolster the administrative record. What is the administrative record? Generally, that is all the evidence that an agency uses to support the action or to provide the agency with additional insight or information it might not otherwise have. They can only make a decision based on what's in that administrative record. And the administrative record includes things that they themselves consider, but it also includes whatever you bring to the table through public comments. Once you submit your public comments, it becomes part of that administrative record. And any supporting document studies will become part of the administrative record too. If it's not in the administrative record, they can't use it as part of their decision-making process. Another reason, which is kind of related to the second one, but kind of different, is to preserve arguments for parties to litigate. When do we do this? When we oppose the rule or want to defend it is when parties litigate. And so generally, an argument can't be raised in litigation in an action unless it was raised to the agency during the comment period. So if you want to sue on something later on, whether to defend a rule that you supported or to oppose a rule that's finalized that you think there's something wrong with it, if you didn't raise it in comments, you can't raise it in litigation. So that's another reason why it's really important to do public comments. The other thing is that agencies have a legal obligation to respond to all substantive comments. So if they respond poorly to your comment, this could support your legal argument in later litigation that they didn't adequately consider the issue, that they were arbitrary in dismissing it. So again, you have to submit the comments to preserve these arguments. And finally, why do it? It's to engage stakeholders and communities to organize and build power around issues, especially around federal rulemaking that can, have a really wide impact across the country, let's say around a power plant sector. It gives folks a great opportunity to engage communities and stakeholders and then organize and explain why the action is really important and also what your organization is doing around the issues that the rule involves. Oh, sorry. Finally, the last reason why you might submit public comments is to signal political support or opposition. And that's important too, to say, hey, we think if the public thinks this is a great thing that this agency is doing, or as I think this is a horrible thing that this agency is doing. Regardless, you should always prepare your comments with a goal in mind. That will make your comments sharper. So what kind of things should you raise in your comments to be effective and considered by the agency? I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but here are a list of issues that get analyzed inside rulemaking that you might want to think to comment on. So things around social health, safety, or environmental impacts, vulnerable populations and EJ issues, emission of cost and benefits. If they didn't mention, like we were talking earlier about cost and benefits, if they didn't mention certain costs or benefits to be weighed that you think are important, you should raise in the comments. Non-monetized effects, we mentioned that earlier, things that you can't monetize but you can describe, you want to make sure those things are in there, like social equity issues. Lived experience, I think in the EJ kind of context, this is really important. It's like sharing the story because oftentimes in rulemaking, these can get, the impacts can get really theoretical, and telling lived experience stories can be powerful in highlighting what the real world consequence of an action might be. And then finally, public engagement. If you believe there needs to be more public input or hearings, you can request those in your comments. So tips for preparing public comments. Here are some tips that will kind of make your comments more effective from the perspective of the agency. So first, be specific. The more specific you are, the more specific their response will have to be to your comment itself. Say what you support and say as well as what you don't like, and be very specific about that. Tell your story, explain your stake in the issue and why it matters, and support your points with as much facts as possible. So we often say, and when we're preparing comments, and we prepare a lot of comments at Policy Integrity, is to use your first 2 pages very wisely. Usually that's a short introduction, 1 to 2 pages laying out the key points clearly and succinctly. Use bullet points. Use of bullet points can be really effective here to highlight what your key points are. And using bold text like you see I use on this presentation for key points in the introduction are usually very effective in highlighting. Headlines, these are really important. And what are headlines? Headlines are kind of argumentative statements. So the reader can read just a headline and know the section's main argument. So it might be like, the proposed rule fails to consider impacts to low-income communities of color. Something like that. It's an argumentative statement and you want to put it up there. And then what it shows is that everything beneath that headline is going to be details that support that argument and reasons why that's true. So every distinct point should get a headline, and use your judgment, but err on the side of more headlines. The reason why is because agencies often will get hundreds, if not thousands, of comments on things, and they'll often hire third-party contractors to review those comments, and oftentimes they may just pull the headers and bullets. So having those headlines, those bullets there, bolding them, having lots of them, that will ensure that they get captured for the agency to see. Okay, so now that we've gone through rulemaking and kind of like the basics of it, we're going to talk about this EPA risk management plan case study into EJ and rulemaking. And we're going to watch a video. So let me start this up here.
America, the beautiful, green, and fertile, home to hundreds of diverse cultures and on the forefront of innovation. Our country is abundant in food, technology, and resources. Unfortunately, it is also abundant in highly volatile chemical facilities that threaten the lives of nearly 200 million Americans every day. Across America, over 12,000 high risk chemical facilities clutter the landscape. Roughly 40% of the population live within 3 miles of facilities that are at constant risk of leaking or spilling toxic chemicals or exploding and destroying the communities around them. These areas are called fence line zones. It sounds crazy, right? To say that nearly 200 million people in America are placed in daily danger? Yeah, it's true. The EPA reports that from 2004 to 2013, there were over 2,200 fires, explosions, and chemical releases at RMP facilities, 1,500 of which caused reportable harm, including over $2 billion in property damage, the evacuation or shelter in place of 500,000 people, over 17,000 injuries, and 58 deaths. That's an average of one incident at a high risk facility every other day in America. The people living in fence line zones are disproportionately Black and Latino. The poverty rate in these communities is much higher than the rest of America. None of these people had a choice in allowing such dangerous facilities to be built, yet they are the ones that must live with the risks. These communities living within the fence line zones are fighting every day for cleaner air and safer lives. In addition to the tangible dangers posed by leaks or explosions at high risk facilities, there's also a complex web of factors that contributes to compromising the health of those living in fence line zones. Exposure to air pollution leads to an increase in respiratory distress and illness. Breathing toxic air increases cancer risks. Most fence line communities lack access to healthy groceries, relying on corner stores and dollar stores for most of their food. Studies have shown that higher poverty rates increase health risks. The constant stress of living with a possible chemical disaster impacts health even further. In addition, many fence line zones are located in areas considered vulnerable to severe weather due to climate change, increasing the likelihood of a disaster significantly. Even if you don't directly live in a fence line zone, there is a high chance your work, school, or hospital may be within one. 39% of hospitals and nursing homes in the US fall within fence line zones, placing sick and vulnerable people in harm's way, many of whom are not able to evacuate on their own when disasters occur. 45% of America's schools are within 3 miles of a high risk facility, putting them within a fence line zone. That's over 56,000 schools that are in immediate and serious danger in the event of a spill, leak, or explosion. When the West Texas fertilizer plant exploded one night in 2013, it damaged or destroyed 150 buildings. The blast obliterated the neighboring middle school. If the accident had happened on a school day, every student would have been in the fatal blast radius, and the death toll would have been astounding. All schools within the district closed while health hazards were assessed, disrupting the lives of students and their families for miles around. Everyone has a right to live, work, and raise their children without being in constant danger from toxic chemical pollution. There are many organizations and thousands of community leaders calling for change. Those living in fence line zones are not silent. They are passionate and well organized, working for change and fighting the companies that threaten their lives. Here's how you can support these community activists. Share their campaigns and donate to their causes.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Welcome back, everybody. Oh, wait. Why is it doing this? Sorry, technical difficulty here. Let me just go to the next slide. So I think that's a pretty effective video. I mean, that video to me is almost like a public comment. It raises all the issues around that proposed rule and then talks about what those impacts are, citing studies and statistics. But anyways, just for context, I want to show a map of how many RMP facilities are in New York, New Jersey. In New York, there are 317 RMP facilities, and in New Jersey, there are 173. So you can see the impact of this federal rule is pretty significant just in New Jersey and New York. Never mind the rest of the country where, the video talked about there were thousands of these facilities around the country. And look where they are. They're in very densely populated areas, and they're all over our states. So the video was created by Coming Clean and Environmental Justice Health Alliance, which were the EJ advocates who led this campaign. Coming Clean, what is a network of over 100 organizations and technical experts, including grassroots activists, community leaders, scientists, business leaders, lawyers, farm worker advocates, green groups, and Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, EJHA, is a national network of grassroots environmental and economic justice organizations in fence line communities in 10 states that are disproportionately impacted by toxic chemicals from legacy contamination and ongoing exposure to polluting facilities. They led the campaign and they represented, like I said before, experts, grassroots activists, green groups, health experts, and then actual communities living on the fence line of these facilities. So what is the RMP rule? So when Congress passed the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, it required EPA to publish regulations and guidance for chemical accident prevention at facilities using substances that pose the greatest risk of harm from accidental releases. And as part of that, it required EPA to develop a risk management plan for these facilities that include a hazard assessment, a prevention program, and an emergency response program. So I'm going to walk through kind of the history of the rule for various reasons. One, to kind of show you how, all the stuff we talked about earlier about the process of rulemaking, how it plays out, how politics matter. You'll see here that different presidential administrations with varying views on a rule like this changed the look of the rule. And then also to show how communities and advocates stuck to it all the way through and were able to win a campaign. So 1990, those amendments are passed, creating the RMP requirement. 1996, EPA releases the final RMP rule. So it took them 6 years. It's a long time, right? And then 2004, there was a series of industrial accents that the video kind of alluded to that led EPA to propose changes to make the rule stronger. And then 2004, the same year, industry began pushing back and bringing lawsuits to stall the proposed changes. Then President Obama came into office. And in 2013, there was a fertilizer plant explosion that's referenced in the video that kills 15 and injures 250. And in reaction to that, President Obama issues Executive Order 13650, which directs EPA to expand their RMP rule. A year later, in 2014, EPA publishes a request for information. EJ advocates commented on that. And then 2 years later, EPA published the notice of proposed rulemaking and held public hearings. And EJ advocates testified and submitted comments to that. In 2016, EJ advocates met with OIRA. And then in 2017, the RMP rule is finalized. However, President Trump enters office. In 2017, after he entered office, trade associations, oil and chemical companies, and 10 state attorney generals filed petitions with EPA requesting the rule be reconsidered and stayed. Remember earlier we talked about the 3 ways that rulemaking can happen. The third way was through petition. So this is an example of these industry and states asking EPA not to make a new rule, but to reconsider, stay, withdraw a rule that had been finalized. In 2017, EPA proposed to delay the RMP rule to 2019. And then at the end of 2017, they finalized and effectively delayed the implementation of that rule to 2019. In 2018, EPA proposes a new rule that rolls back the President Obama era amendments. And in 2019, EJ advocates met with OIRA to oppose the rule. In 2019, EPA finalizes the RMP rule that rolls back President Obama era amendments. And then President Biden comes into office. And in 2021, EPA announces that it plans to restore the RMP rules. In 2022, EPA releases a notice of proposed rulemaking that reintroduces President Obama's rules that never took effect. In 2022, EPA also holds 3 public hearings as part of the notice of proposed rulemaking, and EJ advocates testify and urge EPA not only to bring back the Obama-era rules, but to strengthen them. In 2022, EJ advocates and over 80 allied organizations filed joint comments. In 2022, they also published reports, one that finds there's been over 825 hazardous chemical incidents since 2021, kind of emphasizing that, this is an emergency and inaction has led to even more incidents. In 2023, EJ advocates and green groups have joint meetings with OIRA to support and strengthen the rule. And then in May of this year, EPA finalized the rule. So the final rule incorporated many key recommendations. And these are just some of them, but these are some of the ones I thought were really important. One, it required petroleum refineries, chemical plants, and coal product manufacturing facilities to assess whether they could use safer chemicals and processes. This was big for the EJ folks to say, not only do we want to manage the current processes that cause these accidents, but also we want them to consider safer substitutes. It also required all RMP facilities to assess climate-related hazards. That was really important for communities as well. It also required backup power for existing air monitors. So when there's an accident and maybe power goes out and you're unable to kind of see what are the air emissions, that there's backup power to make sure those air monitors capture that data. It improved worker participation in hazard assessments. It made certain RMP data publicly available. A lot of that kind of publicly available data allows us to kind of find out where the facilities are and map them and find out what chemicals are there. And that's one of the tools actually used to show that map before, how many are in New Jersey and New York. And then also it required third-party compliance audits and investigation of root cause of incidents. There was an EJ analysis in the rule, and so I thought it would be worth kind of talking about what that looked like. EPA's EJ analysis in the rule showed that people of color and low-income populations are more likely to be in proximity to RMP facilities, and they're at greater risk. That means they're more likely to be exposed if a hazardous release occurs than other populations. EPA cited 3 studies and reports to support that finding, including one from EJHA that found populations vulnerable to release from chemical facilities were disproportionately Black and Latino. That report is what that video I showed you earlier is based on. The analysis also included kind of a narrative, all the steps they took to have fair treatment, meaningful participation, hearings, comments, all whatnot. And it is interesting, though, but this particular rule did not perform distributional analysis in the regulatory impact analysis. Perhaps that could have been because the EJ analysis was so conclusive, but it is important to point out that wasn't in there. So how did the communities build power on this rule and win? One is they organized a coalition and they built a campaign. This photo over here shows folks from Coming Clean and EJHA. They prioritized this rule and organized a multi-year campaign to defend the rule and urge EPA to strengthen it. They spent almost 20 years documenting issues at these facilities, issuing reports, and then meeting with the agency elected officials to demand action. And they organized joint comment letters where over 80 organizations and experts signed on. Another thing that they did, which I thought was really effective, is that you can see in this photo over here, they're holding up these posters, talking about industrial chemical accidents in Mossville, Louisiana, in North Dakota when a train derailed, from the BP Deepwater Horizon. And so they engaged media and they heightened national awareness when these hazardous chemical disasters made national news. Of course, during this rulemaking process, the East Palestine train derailment occurred too, which brought that attention again on these hazardous chemical releases. They also partnered with mainstream NGOs on strategy, comments, and agency meetings. And so really kind of brought all these organizations together to weigh in on the rule. They brought various experts to comment on the proposed rules themselves, scientists, technical experts, health experts, engineers that have expertise about facilities. And finally, they stuck to the battle all the way to the end, regardless of what administration was in office. and they participated at every level and opportunity that was available. And I can't stress enough how important that is. I mean, on one hand, you could say this could be somewhat of a depressing story because it took so long, but in my mind, I think it's a victory, and it's an example of how communities can really affect federal rulemaking, and the different pieces that go into it, and how it also can help you build power locally by working on something federally. So that wraps up my presentation today, and I'm happy and excited to take questions and answers from all of you. And I guess that's good. So there's two ways you can ask questions. One way is you can put that in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I can call on you. So questions, anybody?
And there is one in the chat so far, Al, if you can see it.
Okay, yeah, okay, sorry.
No,
really,
no worries.
really briefly, have you seen impact on science-based or EJ-based rulemaking from federal agencies because of SCOTUS overturning Chevron defense? That's a great question, and I think it's a little early to see that because these issues are just making their way through the courts. And just to be clear, I mean, what the Chevron defense, so just for everyone who's out there who might be asking, what is Chevron defense? That is the Supreme Court decision in Loper-Bright, essentially ended the Chevron deference, which previously had said that courts, when reviewing rules that get challenged, need to defer to these agencies and their expertise. And what the Loper-Bright case essentially said was that no, that it's up to the courts to decide that. The courts are the ones who will decide based on reviewing all the evidence whether an agency exceeded its authority, whether they were acting arbitrarily or capriciously in making the rule. So in some ways, it changes that age-old kind of deference. And that deference came from kind of a long history. I mean, when Congress passes a law, they can't possibly know exactly what the law, the regulation should look like. For example, the Clean Water Act might say you need to prevent discharges of pollution into waters, but when they wrote the law, they weren't like you could only have this many parts per million of this contaminant and this parts per million of that contaminant. They usually defer to the agencies to do that because the agency has experts that can review it, they can update the law. A lot of these laws are passed in the 70s and they need to be updated. And so traditionally, that courts give deference to those agencies to kind of figure that out. A lot of the most recent kind of Supreme Court cases around Chevron defense, and there was also, as you all know, there was the other case that that kind of limited the major questions doctrine cases around the power plant rule, the West Virginia case, have really served the effect of limiting when a rule is finalized what a court considers when deciding whether to overturn a rule or to say that an agency exceeded their authority. So that was a long explanation, but basically, I think what you start seeing is that agencies are going to be very cautious, and if anything, they're going to have a lot more analytical data to justify their decision, right? Because I mean, if you're going to be questioned on deference, then one reaction to that is to really provide and show your homework of how you got there and show what you considered and what you didn't consider, and and what data is out there. So I mean, I guess that might be bad. And in the EJ field, I think part of that is, I mean, again, there's also other cases that could affect EJ-based rulemaking, like the Students for Fair Admission Supreme Court case that prohibited kind of race-based policies like affirmative action. Those are all things probably now that are affecting how agencies are thinking about these issues. But I think it remains to be seen how that changes how they go through this rulemaking process itself. Sorry, that was a really long answer to that question, but there was a lot to unpack there. I see a question here saying, what tactics are there to connect frontline people to regulatory decision-making? And what tactics to make agencies pay attention to EJ work? I think we did discuss this a bit in the training earlier. As I was saying before, I think for frontline folks, the first tactic is to engage, and then tell your story. And tell the story in a way that matches what an agency is considering. So that slide I had up earlier that showed, things you might want to consider commenting on, those are all things that draw lines back to what an agency is required to think about. Like, what options do they decide? What are the cost and benefits of a rule to society? Whether there's equity implications, right? These are all things that, and you want to do them in a way and speak in a language that mirrors kind of what they're required to consider. And I kind of was saying before, like, you might want to take like things like equity, social equity, EJ, and describe them in a cost benefit analysis way to be like, well, here are some costs that you're not considering to these populations, right? And as well as in the EJ analysis, you want to be raising those very similar types of points as well. Tactics to make agencies pay more attention to EJ work. I think we mentioned before, storytelling, that example of the RMP rule, they did that storytelling. First they started by organizing and talking and bringing together communities that were on the fence lines of these facilities and getting them involved in stressing how this is going to impact them. Then they issued reports that really collect with experts and collected data. Like, here's how many accidents there were. Here's how many deaths there were. Here's what could have happened. Here's what these communities look like. Here's the burdens they're already historically bearing. And on top of that, these facilities add X, Y, and Z. And when these facilities have accidents, here are the type of impacts they might face. So really being specific and doing that story. And then I think, like as I was mentioning during the training, then it's telling those stories to the media, tying them back to real world things that people can see, like real accidents that are occurring in real time, and then re-emphasizing there's people behind these events. So these events have real world consequences. These are just not theoretical cost benefit. Like, how much will these regulations cost industry? We'll also look at the real cost to these communities and telling that through storytelling, through statistics, through data. Other questions anyone else has? Any hands anyone want to raise? I have a question here. Does each agency have specific legally required standard policy on how it engages the public, notifies the public, etc.? There are some general requirements, like I said before, under the Administrative Procedures Act that require notice and comment and publishing all this stuff on the Federal Register for the public to see. And so that stuff is required for all agencies. Now, the only exception I would make are for independent agencies, like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They technically are not part of the rest of the executive branch agencies. They're designed that way through statute to be a little more independent. However, many of these agencies have said they're following these processes, but they might have variations on how they do public notice, whether they have and where they notice or post that and how they respond to them. But generally, the Administrative Procedures Act requires all to do that on top of the EJ executive orders, the executive orders on regulatory rulemaking that presidents have issued, as well as internal guidance has been issued that say, here's how you should do notice and comment. And I said before, hearings are also, unless the law may require that they hold hearings, and then the other part is agencies might have specific policies around them. But on the whole, hearings usually are not required, but if there's great public interest, more often than not, an agency will hold them. Any other questions? I see one here on how can we better understand how EJ is perceived and engages with politics. I think I covered that already, so I'm not going to get in there again. So I want to make sure I share a screen before we wrap up here. And let me just get this up here. If you all could, you can take this QR code here on the left. Includes a survey that you can do about this training so we can improve our trainings moving forward and also just get feedback on what worked, what didn't work. And also here's another QR code to join our mailing list if you're not already on it, as well as our email on the top here for the TCTAC and our website link as well. And I'll leave that up there while we wrap up here. If there's not any more questions, did something just point up here? Let me see.
No, that was just me thanking everyone. Sorry.
Yes, yeah, so thank you for joining. All this will be posted on the TCTAC website, which also is going to be updated soon. And really appreciate everyone who came today, and hopefully you found this training useful.